Here's what happens when you experience awe. It leads to what we call shrinking of the self. You feel smaller when you're in the presence of something vast and indescribable. And when you feel smaller, so does your chatter. So experiencing awe, it's like the ultimate perspective broadener.
How do we stop negative thoughts? Because this is something that you've written extensively about. I'm excited to talk about the topic of your new book, Chatter.
Yeah.
But I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with: negative thoughts, rumination. How do we pump the brakes on all that?
Well, there's no single magic pill. And that's something I feel pretty strongly about conveying to folks, because I think we often hear that, hey, there's this one thing you should do, like be in the moment or talk to someone. And it turns out there are no single magic pills that we can take. But what there are many different tools that can often be used together to help us pump the brakes on our tendency to ruminate and worry. I break them down into three categories, or things you could do on your own: people tools, and then environmental tools. And within each of those buckets, there are lots of different strategies that exist. If we want to dive right into them, some of the things you could do on your own, a lot of the tools that are helpful involve being able to get some distance from what's happening inside your head. When we get stuck in a negative thought loop, what I call chatter, we zoom in really narrowly on whatever's bugging us. And it's all we could think about. We're stuck in this tunnel vision. When that happens, being able to step back and look at the bigger picture can often be really, really helpful. And it turns out there are lots and lots of different ways to zoom out in that manner. One of my favorite tools, and something I use on my own, is my first line of defense against rumination, is something we call distant self-talk, which involves trying to coach yourself through a problem using your own name and the second person pronoun you. You want to do this silently, not out loud while walking down the streets of LA. But the idea here is I'm thinking, all right, Ethan, how are you going to manage this situation? What we know about people is it is much easier for us to give advice to other people than it is for us to give advice to ourselves. I'll often ask folks when I'm doing presentations, hey, have you ever been in a situation where a friend or a loved one comes to you with a problem? They're spinning. They're totally stuck in chatter. They don't know what to do. They present the problem to you, and it's easy for you to coach them through it. Inevitably, all the hands in the room go up. What's happening there is you've got distance from your friend's problem. So it's easy for you to be wise and objective. And what we've learned is that language provides us with a really useful hack, if you will, for shifting our perspective, for getting us to think about our own circumstances like we were thinking about someone else's. That gives us mental space, which can often be really useful for managing chatter. So that's the first thing I'll do. The second thing that I'll do, a second research or science-based tool I'll implement, is something we call temporal distancing, which involves thinking about how you're going to feel about whatever you're worried or ruminated about sometime down the road, tomorrow, a week from now, a year from now, when you're on your deathbed. What that does is it makes clear to us, hey, whatever you're struggling with, as awful as it seems, it's temporary. It will eventually pass, because most of the things we struggle with do temper with time. We're not always aware of that in the moment, though. And simply becoming aware of that does something really powerful for us. It gives us hope. And that makes it a lot easier for us to move on with our lives. So those are two very simple tools that are my first line of defense. Interestingly enough, that second one, temporal distancing, one of the reasons I like that tool is it really also makes a point that you don't always want to be in the moment, right? We often hear it's so useful to be in the moment. Being in the moment at times can be very helpful, but sometimes being in the moment doesn't help us. And in fact, what that strategy involves doing is taking ourselves out of the moment and going forward in time. That ability to travel in time in our mind is a remarkable feat of evolution.
Wow, that is super interesting and also really counterintuitive. Just to, throw my own experience into the mix. I've been seeing a therapist for the first time for the past 8 months. And one of the things that she teaches me is that returning to the moment is a way to get out of those acute states of anxiety and depression, right? Because depression is you're worrying about something that's you're ruminating on something that occurred in the past, right? And anxiety is excessive worry about the future.
Yeah.
And so we always talk about how reorienting your focus to the present moment is a way out. It's like the eject button from both of those mind states. And it's also, I feel like, one of the goals of meditation, right, is to be better at bringing your focus back into the present. But this is what's, I think, so interesting about what you're saying is that sometimes hitting that eject button isn't necessarily a bad idea.
Well, so here's one way I like to think about this. So being in the moment is one tool of many, and it can be useful when you're stuck in the past or the future to reorient on what's happening right now, like your breathing and how your stomach feels as you breathe in and out, which is often a tool that's used to focus people on the moment. Like that can be useful at times. The message, though, that being in the moment is the cure for rumination and worry, I think that takes it too far. And it actually runs the risk of giving people the wrong idea, which is that if you're lost in thought in the past or the future, that's a bad thing. The ability to travel in time in your mind is a remarkable gift that we possess, right? It allows us to learn from our mistakes. It allows us to savor past experiences and conquests, right? It allows us to plan for the future. I'm going on vacation for the first time in a while with my family. And like, I'm fantasizing about what I'm going to be doing on that vacation. It brings me enormous joy to walk around my neighborhood and just get lost in thought. And it's also, I would argue, one of the factors that allows me to be somewhat productive, right? Because I'm anticipating things that might happen in the future. I'm preparing for them. What we want to do as individuals is not turn off our ability to travel in time in our mind. What we want to do is figure out how can we become better mental time travelers. The problem is sometimes we go to the past and we get stuck there. Like we can't get back into the present or in the future, and we can't get out of that paralyzing fear, catastrophizing future. That's not good. But there are lots of tools that exist that involve just helping people become more fluid at mental time travel. Sometime, focusing on the present, that can be one thing, but there are 26 other tools I talk about that don't involve that are out there as well.
I love it. So it's really just giving people the option to not be so rigidly stuck in the present.
Exactly. It not being so rigidly stuck in the present. Absolutely.
I love that. When it comes to the self-talk that you were talking about, I forgot the term that you used for it, but the way that we can
distanced self-talk.
Distanced self-talk. Yeah. Give me some examples of that and contexts where that might be particularly useful.
Yeah, well, so let me give you so first of all, this is an interesting tool because, most of the time when you hear people talking about themselves in the third person, you instantly think, oh, narcissism or, out of touch with reality. In fact, we and others have done a lot of research on this, and there's no link between trying to coach yourself through a problem using your name and narcissism. There are lots of great examples throughout history of people using this technique under times of stress. And one of the things I find fascinating about it is that a lot of people just stumble on this tool. It's not like anyone has taught them to do it. They just, for some reason, when they're stressed out, they do this weird thing. They start coaching themselves through the problem using their own name. It's like being their own coach. And research shows that it can be useful. Two of my favorite examples. Malala Yousafzai, youngest person ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. When she's the story for listeners, if they're not familiar, is Malala's a young girl living in a Taliban-controlled region of Pakistan. She feels very strongly about the rights of young women to get an education, and the Taliban, basically get wind of this. They don't like it. She keeps on doing advocacy work, and they basically threaten to kill her. And they don't just threaten to kill her; they follow up with that threat. She's taking a bus home from school one day. An assassin boards a bus, shoots her in the face. She goes on to make a miraculous recovery and wins the Nobel Peace Prize for the advocacy work that she continues to do. And around the time she wins a prize, she goes on the Jon Stewart show. And he asked her a question that if I were with her, I would have asked her, which is like, you just find out that a well-organized terrorist group is plotting to assassinate you. What's going through your head? And she then recounts the story. And you could search for this on the internet, this clip. She says, I used to think to myself, what would I do if the Tali would come to get me? And then I would reply to myself, Malala, just take a shoe and hit him. But then I would say to myself, if you take a shoe, you would be no different than the Tali. So you must treat others with compassion. So what's striking about this example is she's contemplating the most stressful experience I think any of us can imagine. Someone coming to kill us. She starts off all in the first person, the way we normally reflect on our lives. I, me, my. And then the moment she gets to the most stressful part of that experience, she switches. She starts giving herself advice like she would be coaching her best friend. Malala, this is what you need to do. It's exactly the phenomenon that we see playing out in the lab. When you tell people to use their name to work through a problem, you find that they generate wiser solutions to the issues they're struggling with. They recognize the limits of their own knowledge. They take other people's perspectives, and they cope and perform better under stress. So that's one concrete example. One other quick one that's fun is actually from someone in your backdoor neighborhood. What's the expression here? I'm
my neck of the woods.
Your neck of the woods. It's late. It's late here on the East Coast. You'll have to forgive me. Your neck of the woods. LeBron James, when he's first deciding whether to stay with the Cleveland Cavaliers or move on to a different team about 10 years ago, he does an interview on ESPN, and he says to himself, and he says out loud during this interview, this was a really, really difficult emotional decision. LeBron James got to do what is best for LeBron James. So, the moment he says this is a difficult emotional decision that I'm grappling with, he then switches again to using his own name, putting him in this objectivity mode. So that's one really simple thing you can do. And one of the reasons I love that technique and why I use it myself is, like every 4 to 6 weeks, I'll wake up at 2 a.m. Don't know why, but it just happens. And I wake up, eyes wide open. I've got some chatter when that happens. And I can use this technique, right? Like right in the heat of the moment when it doesn't take much effort. I don't have to spend 15 minutes repeating a mantra, though that can be useful too. It's just a simple thing to do to give us a little perspective.
It's a lot different. I feel like that, when we're stuck in these times of worry, I think the self-talk that often ensues is, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? But reframing it to, what would Max do in this situation? It gets you to think a bit about the situation a little bit differently.
Totally. I mean, just think about what happens if your best friend comes to you with a problem that they're catastrophizing and worrying about. If you're a good advisor for that friend, you're gonna coach them through the situation, as bad as it is. And often, sometimes, like, our friends come to us with really difficult, thorny situations, but we can still give them advice and coach them through. And I would argue that we often lack that ability to coach ourselves through our problems when we're struggling with worry and rumination. Rather than coming up with that game plan, it may not be the perfect game plan, but at least it's a game plan that you can test out. Rather than coming up with that, we're just spiraling in negative emotion. What if this happens? And then this happens. And oh my God. And, after about 60 seconds, it's remarkable. You go from just having this little seed of doubt planted to, either being dead or in jail, right? Like, that's how the mind works. That's how quickly we can catastrophize things. And, most of my best buddies who I talk to about, if I have some chatter, they're never doing that for me. There may be some people out there who might want to coach you into disarray, but I would argue that those are probably not the best people to talk to. So
I love this though. Talk to yourself the way that you talk to a friend.
Exactly.
It's so intuitive, and yet so few of us do talk to ourselves that way, right? Like, why, Dr. Kross, why is it so difficult for us to find empathy for ourselves?
Well, I think you're tapping into that's a fantastic question. Let me respond to it in a few different ways. First of all, What I find fascinating is this fact that we often just stumble on tools that work for us. Sometimes we stumble on things that we think work, which actually don't. But this idea of coaching yourself by like talking to someone else, like giving yourself advice like you'd give a friend, there are records of people doing this throughout time. Julius Caesar wrote an entire book in the third person, recounting how he dealt with, wartime exploits. Many other people, like illustrious people throughout history, have done this as well. Up to Jennifer Lawrence, who was doing a New York Times interview a few years ago, got flustered and was like, "Jennifer, come on, get your act together. You can do this." Like right during the interview, she's quoted, and so I find it fascinating as a scientist that we don't really know how people learn this, but it just kind of gets in there. And then some people keep on using it. And the value of talking about this with you and with others is it gives us the possibility to be deliberate about using these tools in our lives. So we don't have to wait to just figure out, oh, yeah, that made us feel better, or do it without knowing it. The moment I know, the moment I find myself slipping into some worry, I immediately activate this tool. As to why we don't do it all the time, this is an example of when you get stuck in rumination, our immediate attempt is to focus really narrowly on what is happening to us. So we zoom in on the problem, right? Because that makes sense. It needs all of your attention. The problem is when we zoom in really narrowly on a problem, sometimes the emotion gets so intense that we get stuck thinking about that issue over and over again, and we can't break out to get the broader perspective.
Wow, very interesting. Yeah, sometimes it is, you feel like you are stuck in a rut. I mean, that phrase exists, I think for a reason, because it's such a relatable sensation when you're caught in the fog of worry.
Yeah, it's an incredibly common experience. When people tell me, "Oh yeah, I have some chatter, I worry, I ruminate," I say, congratulations, welcome to the human condition. It's incredibly common. And it's also, I think, one of the big problems we face as a culture, because what we know about getting stuck in these negative thought loops is it makes it really hard for us to think and perform. So if you've ever had the experience of trying to read a couple of pages in a book when you're worried about something, you read the pages, but you don't remember anything once you're done. That's an example of how this can really sabotage us at work, right? Because you only have so much attention to focus at any given period of time. If all of your attention is on your worries and ruminations, it doesn't leave anything else over to do the things we often want and need to do, like our jobs or being good listeners to our friends and loved ones. So it makes it hard to think and perform, creates friction in our relationships with others, damages our physical health. It's a huge issue.
What are some of the more common types of negative self-talk? I'm not good enough. I'm not deserving.
It can take many different forms. Being self-critical, like you suck. I am terrible. I can't do this. Negative self-talk can also take the form of rehearsing things that you're angry about, like over and over, about some other people, just not being able to let go of things. That, like, if someone has transgressed you in some way, you just replay over and over and over what that person said, and it keeps you lit up as a result. There's also a depressogenic inner monologue that we can engage in as well. So there are many, what we say to ourselves can vary quite a bit. The common theme, though, across these different harmful forms of self-talk is that we're getting stuck in a loop. We are repeating these things over and over, which over time is really troubling, because when we do that, that keeps those negative feelings active over long stretches of time in ways that can exert a wear and tear on our body and our health. Now, I do want to be clear. Experiencing negative thoughts is not a bad thing, right? There's a difference between experiencing a momentary blip of self-critique and continuing to rehearse that over and over again. I and many other scientists believe that we evolve the ability to experience negative emotions for a reason. You wouldn't want to actually live a life without the ability to experience anxiety, anger, sadness. They're all functional in small doses. So to give you an example, if I don't experience a little bit of anxiety before a big presentation, what happens is I don't prepare for that presentation. And then I don't do a good job at that presentation. So that anxiety is a signal that tells me, hey, time to get moving, buddy. Time to start preparing. Anger, like being transgressed, is really useful to know, hey, someone has just violated me or my space, and I need to decide now how to respond to prevent this from happening again. What makes those responses useful, though, is they happen and then they subside and you move on with your life. If you keep replaying things over and over in your head, that keeps those negative emotions active over longer periods of time. And that's what makes them harmful.
I had an experience not too long ago with a neighbor where one of my good friends came over and he parked in a way that was, not, he wasn't using all, we'll just say he wasn't using all of his brain cells when he parked the way that he did. But nonetheless, my neighbor overreacted and she became incredibly vitriolic and hostile and was yelling at him. And then I came out to see what was going on and she started yelling at me. And I've never really had an interaction with this person before in my life. I barely know anything about her. But that whole experience got me so heated and stressed out. And the way that she talked to me and the way that I experienced her talking to my friend, who I'm very protective with my friends, I couldn't stop replaying that scene in my brain to the point that I didn't get any sleep the following night. And in reality, that experience impacted my life zero, right? Like there was no functional impact on my life that experience had. But nonetheless, it affected my sleep. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. And we know that even on one night of poor sleep, your health is completely dysregulated the next day. And it really, it drove home everything that you're talking about. And I wish I had these tools back then when this experience occurred.
Yeah. Well, I think, what you're describing is incredibly common. And as someone who studies this stuff and has for 20 years, I have my own neighbor experience that has happened to me on occasion. And it really gives you firsthand experience of just how toxic getting stuck in these negative thought loops can be, right? That's how you get from having this adaptive anger response, do things like predict episodes of cardiovascular disease, right? Because you have the stress response that's activated when your neighbor pisses you off, but then you keep on replaying the experience in your head. And so that stress response remains chronically activated over time, which is not what we are set up to do. Look, knowing about these techniques, I think the real value they serve is they give you things to do when you find yourself spiraling. And we've only talked about, I think, 2 actually out of close to 30 that are out there. So you mentioned friends. Let's talk about friends, because I think this is another, in some ways, intuitive, but also incredibly counterintuitive set of tools that I'd love to get out there for folks. Because I think many of us have this intuition that, it's social support. It's a good thing. You hear about it all the time, right? But the message that we often hear is that when you're struggling with chatter, the thing you want to do is find someone to just unload your emotions, to just get it off your chest, express your feelings with someone who's empathic. There's been a lot of research on this over the years. And what we've learned is that just venting about your feelings to someone else, this can be really good for strengthening the friendship bonds or relational bonds between 2 people. Like, it feels good to know that there are some people out there that I could turn to who are willing to take the time to hear me out, not judge me, and just empathize. Like, no question, that's good for relationships. But if all you do in a conversation is express your emotions and vent, what ends up happening is you leave that conversation, you feel really good about the person you just talked to, but you're often just as upset, if not more upset, by the time you finish the conversation, because all you've done is rehearse the negativity. The technical term for this is you're co-ruminating with someone else about a problem.
Wow.
And it turns out that predicts a host of negative outcomes. So what's the solution? The solution is to not stop talking to other people. Other people are still useful. What you want to do, though, in a conversation is two things. You do want to take some time to share what you're feeling with someone else. They need to learn about what you've gone through. But at a certain point in the conversation, the person you're talking to, they ideally start nudging you to look at that bigger picture. So Max, let's look this neighbor. You don't even know who this is. You're never going to see them again. And if you do, who cares? You get in your car. Like, let's focus on some other stuff. So if chatter zooms us in, we're in those negative thought loops, we're just thinking about the thing that's worrying us. What the person you're talking to, what they can help you do is zoom out. They can help you broaden your perspective. That is the formula for being a good chatter advisor to others. And I think the take home here is really twofold, right? Knowing about how these principles work, it gives us the information that we need to be really strategic about who we go to for support. So I don't go to just anyone. I don't go down my contact list and, whoever I can find to talk to, I just talk to. In fact, there are people who I'm very close to. I love them. They love me. Like DNA determines these linkages. If you know what I mean, we're related. I don't ever talk to them about my chatter because I know they want to help, but the way they think they can be helpful is by just getting me to talk. Oh, it sounds so terrible. Oh, I'm sorry. What a jerk. And that's not going to help me ultimately get through it. Instead, I've thought hard about this, and I know there are 3 people out there that I can go to for personal issues. And, these are friends, colleagues, and they'll be really good at both listening and then helping me broaden my perspective. And those are my chatter advisors. Those are the people I consult, and they are an incredible tool. So that's one take home. The other take home is if someone comes to you with a problem that they're struggling with, be mindful of how this works. Don't just ask them, hey, what happened? Oh, it sounds terrible. Do that, but then also try to broaden their perspective.
I love that, because I was just going to ask how we can reciprocate, right? Because we don't want to just be takers and to think about our friends in that way, right? Like, who can I go to solve all of my problems? But what you said is so important, and it's that the best advisor to have and the way to advise people most appropriately in these circumstances is to help them gain a sense of perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, getting that perspective is crucial to working through this chatter because it's exactly what we often lack when we're stuck in a negative thought loop. Now, there is an art to being a good advisor to others when it comes to helping them deal with this, these negative thought loops. And what I mean by that is, depending on who the person is and what they're dealing with, some people need to spend more time just expressing their feelings before they're ready to have their perspective be broadened. So like my wife, if she comes to me with something she's experiencing, she'll talk to me about it. I'll listen. I'm there for her. And at a certain point in the conversation, I'll ask her something. Hey, I totally get it. Can I offer you my perspective on this? And sometimes she'll be like, no, just keep listening. I'm not done. And then, all right. And I keep listening. I try again later on. Other things that she'll come to me with, I'll listen. I ask her the question, hey, I've got a thought. Can I share it? Please tell me. It's why, so you want to just feel that out and be sensitive to it. And I can say from personal experience, just having this scientific blueprint, if you will, for steering these conversations, it's really, really helpful. Like, I'm not dogmatic about it in the sense that I let you talk for 45 seconds and then I start, hey, so what do you think you could do better about it? Right. I don't do that, but I just use this as a guide, and it just gives me a playbook for helping other people, which is something that is actually rewarding to do, I think, for me, in addition to helping others. So
you brought up your wife. Are there gender differences in the way that we deal with chatter, the kinds of solutions that we seek out from our respective advisors?
There are just some gender differences here. So women tend to experience chatter more frequently than men. but they benefit equally from many of the tools that are out there. I always like to give the caveat that there are plenty of things that men do more than women that are bad for them. So it all does even out. Women also do tend to engage in co-rumination at higher levels than men, this kind of getting stuck in these negative Venn sessions. It's a particular problem for adolescent girls, teenage girls. A lot of the research in this space has been documented in that population. So there are some gender differences. One theme of this book is that there are no one size fits all solutions for everyone. So the thing that I like to invite people to do is, there are, let's say, 26 tools that are out there. Familiarize yourself with the tools and then try them out, and then start thinking about, hey, what are the tools that work best for me? What combinations? I can tell you that the 4 or 5 things that I do regularly, which really do nip the chatter in the bud right away for me, they're different from the things that my wife does or my best friend. There are different combinations of tools out there. What scientists have done a really good job at doing over the past 20 years is identifying the individual tools. But what we don't yet have the ability to do is say, oh, Max, this is this problem. These are the 6 tools that you should use. But Fred, you should use these 3. Like, we don't have that capacity. So I think it's up to people to figure these things out for themselves until we have that knowledge.
Well, we've already talked about some of the intrinsic tools that people have access to. We've talked about some of the people tools, right? Being able to seek out advisors, but you also mentioned that there are certain environmental tools. Could we talk about some of those?
Yeah. So these are some of my favorite tools. I find them fascinating that, like, there are things you could do, just ways of interacting with the world around you that impact how we talk to ourselves and how we manage our chatter. I find that mind blowing. So, okay, let me try to convince you of why that is. So I'll go through a few. Here's one thing that I always do when I'm worried about something or ruminating, which is totally out of character for me. I organize my office. I clean up. It's out of character because if you knew me well, or just spoke to my wife, you would know that there's always like a trail of clothing from the shower to the closet to my office, stacks of books, organized thinking. I like to think of myself as an organized thinker, but not physically organized. But when I experience chatter, like, I just stop and I put everything away. And when I clean up my room, I go and clean up the bedroom and then my kids' room sometimes. What I'm doing is I'm trying to compensate for the lack of control that I often feel when I'm stuck in chatter. When you're stuck, worried, or ruminating about something, you're not in control, right? You have this feeling like the thoughts are taking over and you're just along for the ride. And it is not a pleasant ride. And what we've learned is that you can compensate for not feeling control over your mind by exerting control around you. And tidying up and organizing, this is one very simple thing you can do to give yourself that sense of control. Engaging in a ritual is closely related to this. So a ritual is something that it's a rigid sequence of behaviors that you do the exact same way every time. So like many athletes before stressful moments on the court will have a secret handshake and, say certain things. That's under their control, right? There's research which shows rituals can help alleviate chatter. And one of the ways they do so is by giving people this sense of agency, like, I can manage this, and that feels good. So that's one set of environmental tools, exerting order and control around you.
Well, let me ask you just a question there. I mean, can it get to a point though where we start to compensate too much and our desire for control as a compensatory mechanism then becomes pathologic?
Of course.
Can it bleed into OCD, for example? Can it lead to orthorexia, right? For example, when we try to control, when we have no sense of internal control, right? And then we strive to control our diets, and that becomes too much.
Yes.
For example, as an
anorexia. I thought you said orthorexia, and I was going to run with it for a second, but I'm like, what is orthorexia?
No, that's a thing too. That's when you become obsessively well, obsessed with eating a quote unquote healthy diet, and
Oh,
you
okay. I
become,
didn't know that. So that good
yeah.
information I learned.
Wow,
So
I taught the PhD something.
yes, yes. No,
That's
the
awesome.
PhD learns something all the time. There's lots that I don't know. Um,
I love that. I
so
love that. I mean, that's the true mark of a scientist, right? Being able to admit when what you don't know, and
yeah, well, I think the longer you're in the business, the more you realize how much you don't know, and it's humbling and exciting too because it means there's a lot to learn. But back to your fantastic question, yes, you can take these tools to an extreme. I would argue, though, that you could take any of the tools that I talk about in my book to an extreme if you use them haphazardly or in the wrong context. A great analogy here is like take a tool like a hammer. A hammer is, something we use to build homes and lots of beautiful things, but it can also be a source of destruction. And the same is true of all of these tools. I talk about distancing. Being able to step back and think about your experience objectively can be really useful when you're managing chatter. But if you do that when you're hanging out with your family and friends and kids, that can kind of blunt your positive emotions and wouldn't be so effective. And you can make these cases for all of these tools. When I think of the role that rituals and an obsessive focus on ordering plays in these disorders, this is an instance of an otherwise healthy tool being taken to an extreme. And you don't want to take any of these tools to an extreme. At the same time, I think it would be limiting to not use these tools at all because they are associated with certain forms of disorder. I think that would not do us well either. So that's my response to that fantastic question. Let me switch gears and tell you about one other environmental tool. Enhancing your exposure to green spaces, which, maybe it sounds, oh yeah, of course, going for a walk in nature feels good. But actually the science here is a lot deeper than that. What we know is that there are at least two ways that enhancing your exposure to green spaces can help you. One thing it does, it helps restore your attention. Chatter consumes our attention. It's all we can think about. And we know our attention is limited. So that's not a good thing. When you go for a walk in a safe, natural space, what ends up happening is you're surrounded by interesting things and your attention, it gently drifts onto your surroundings. You just kind of take it in. You're not focusing really carefully on, oh, well, let me see how symmetrical that rose is, right? You're just absorbing. And that gives your attention the opportunity to restore itself. The other thing that enhancing your exposure to green spaces does for you is it gives you the opportunity to experience the emotion of awe, which is an emotion we experience when we're in the presence of something vast and indescribable, an amazing sunset or fall foliage. You can experience awe from, humanity made things too. Like I experience awe when I contemplate the fact that we landed a rover on Mars. Like I don't understand, how the hell did we figure out how to blast an SUV into space, land it, and send signal back so we could watch it? Like, fries my circuits. Here's what happens when you experience awe. It leads to what we call shrinking of the self. You feel smaller when you're in the presence of something vast and indescribable. And when you feel smaller, so does your chatter. So experiencing awe, it's like the ultimate perspective broadener. It's like, what am I worried about here? Like, we're struggling with all of this stuff. And I'm worried about like whether the email I wrote before was offensive. So that's another outside in tool, if you will.
I love this. I mean, awe, wonder. There were moments a couple of years ago, I was dealing with a sick loved one, and I was living in New York City. Very stressful time. I shared a tiny apartment with my little brother.
Oh boy.
Which was difficult to say the least. But one of the tools that I had access to was a terrace. So I had a terrace at this tiny apartment. And I remember I would always go out onto that terrace, no matter the time of year. And I would just take in the beautiful New York City skyline actually I was overlooking the East River. So I would see the river and I would see the boats and I would see the vastness of Queens in front of me.
Yeah.
And that would always make me feel better.
Yeah.
Actually, in doing that, I would just go out there and I would allow my gaze to soften, and I would take in this like panoramic view of the city, and yeah, I mean, you just made me realize that as you were talking, because in New York, it's pretty difficult to. There's a lot of man-made objects, obviously, but when you're stuck on the streets, there's really not much to behold, right? Like you're just there's cabs and there's noise, but even if you have access to a terrace or a roof of some sort,
or even a National Geographic video, there's some, there's studies which use videos like that to elicit awe. Max, this is what gets me so excited, right? Because so many people struggle with chatter, and there are tools like you did something, but maybe weren't like totally conscious of why you were doing it, but you'd go out there, and when you did, you'd feel better. And if you think about this carefully now, like you could have a game plan. All right, chatter, here are the 5 things I'm going to do without thinking. I'm going to talk to myself like I give advice to someone else, use my name. I'm going to mentally time travel into the future, go for a walk in nature, and to boot, I'm going to call my chatter advisor buddy on the way back. Like you've got a game plan. You don't have to wait to just try to work through it. Like what that does is it shortens the amount of time you spend bathing in that chatter, which can be so harmful.
It pulls you out of your head.
Yeah, which I think many of us would like to be pulled out of from time to time.
Have you studied the art of, creative expression at all? I was going to say acting, because I feel like I've taken a few acting classes in my life. I've never aspired to be an actor, but I've taken a few acting improv classes, which I found to be very useful. But I also took a few acting lessons just to see what it was all about. And one of the whole things of acting, right, is to like get out of your head. It's to get out of your head and to physically emote.
Yeah.
Have you found any of these kinds of tools to be useful?
Well, the closest that I'm aware of is actually what you mentioned before with improv and comedy more general, and how comedy is often used as a tool to help regulate people's emotions. And there are a few ways that it can work. One of the things, of course, that comedy does is it can activate positive emotions, which are the opposite, antagonistic to the negative muck of chatter. But comedy also puts our experiences in perspective, right? Because it's like, hey, we're poking fun. We have enough space that we can look at this thing and realize I was being an erotic jerk here, and there can be value. I mean, it's another way of getting perspective from your experience. That I think can be quite useful. I haven't looked at acting per se. I'm not aware of research that's looked at that, but that would make sense too. Here's another thing, actually, low-hanging fruit strategy. Anyone's listening, what's another tip? We talked about going in the future with time travel. You can also go back in time, right? Like this mind, it's so flexible if you know where to steer it. When it comes to like COVID, for example, which a lot of us are stressed about or have been, what's gotten me through COVID is I will think about, all right, things are pretty bad right now, but what about the Spanish, flu of 1918? Many more people died. There was no Zoom, no Uber Eats. If that doesn't take the edge off, I go even further back in time. Bubonic plague, right? Middle Ages decimated Europe. And like our lives as we know it were just ended. And that's another way of broadening our perspective. So there are these little, like almost psychological jujitsu moves that we're capable of doing, right? Little ways of shifting our perspective that alters the way we think about our circumstances that help do what you describe, which is get us out of our head, break us out of that chatter.
Yeah, it's so true. And I mean, these are stressful times. I feel like there is a light at the end of the tunnel, though. So I don't know anybody who, at least in my personal life, who's super stressed out about things these days. But certainly there still are some people out there that are. How do you recommend? So you've got this incredible book packed to the brim with really effective and practical tools, chatter. But how do you recommend that people keep these tools front of mind for when quote unquote attack strikes? Like, would you suggest people like have like a like, yeah, how do people just like keep them like locked and loaded so as to utilize them when they actually need them?
Well, so first of all, familiarize yourself with the tools. That's step one. And then start experimenting, figure out which ones actually do seem to help you. And then once you have an idea of what's helpful, you can do something called creating an implementation intention. So, scientists love coming up with complicated phrases to describe simple things. It's really simple. You come up with an if-then plan. You think to yourself ahead of time, if I find myself getting stuck in a negative thought loop, then I'm going to give myself advice like a friend, focus on the future, and go for a walk. And you just rehearse that plan a few times in your head. You could even write it down. And research shows that if you ask people to create these if-then plans, it makes them much, much more likely to follow through with their goals than if you just say to yourself, I'm going to manage my chatter more effectively. The idea is you're creating a mental link between a particular situation and a particular set of behaviors that you're going to implement. And that makes it more likely that you automatically implement those strategies when you need them. So that's one thing you can do. I do think that because so many of these tools are easy to implement, they make it more likely that people will do so. I think one of the reasons meditation doesn't work for some people is because it's really effortful. Like there's a lot of data showing meditation can be really helpful, but when you're stressed out, worried right before a gig or an interview or presentation, people don't often have the time to take 15 minutes and focus on their breath. And so that's, I think, where there's an opportunity here to slot in some of these other tools.
Yeah, I feel like I would want to like in my iPhone, like create a note where I list some of your tools and just just always be cognizant of the fact that note exists, and that if I'm ever at a loss, because it's sort of like, the reason why a musician has a set list on stage with them, right? Of course, they know their catalog, but when you're in the heat of the moment, you forget. It's like I play music, I sing and I play guitar, right? Whenever I've ever been put on the spot with a guitar and somebody's like, "Oh, Max, play something," suddenly every single song that I've ever memorized has gone out the window, and there I am with the guitar in my hands, forgetting what to play. And so I feel like that's kind of how it is. Maybe that's analogous to what it feels like when people are caught in one of these negative feedback loops, right?
Yeah.
You almost have to have a set list of tools at your disposal.
Yeah. I mean, you can break, if we're talking about self-control, emotion control here, right? Effectively, how do you manage your emotions effectively? And there are two things there are two pieces to effective self-control. You've got to be motivated, and you've got to and if you're motivated, then you've got to have access to tools, right? Just being motivated to do something doesn't help if you have the wrong tools. So, and having the tools doesn't help if you're not motivated to use them. So you need both of those things. I think a lot of people are naturally motivated to get rid of their chatter because it's so goddamn painful. But you've got to give them those tools and keep them accessible to folks. So maybe that means like wearing a little rubber band around your wrist that reminds you, hey, like, oh yeah, I'm experiencing chatter. Let me use the tools that I've associated with this rubber band, or doing other things. I like the idea of having a chatter set list on your phone.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. We came up with that together. Yeah. Is there anything that surprised you over the course of writing the book?
Did anything surprise me? The idea, yes, several things surprised me. Some people are so paralyzed by their inner voice that they'd like to get rid of it altogether. I find that really fascinating. And what I mean by that is, like, a lot of people, because they're so consumed by their worries and ruminations, they often will ask me or wonder, hey, how can I just get rid of this inner voice? Which is a remarkable question to ask, because one of the things I talk about in the book is just how useful your inner voice can be, this voice in your head that we possess, right? It helps you simulate and plan and tell stories, but it can be so painful that people just want to get rid of it. That was surprising.
And people do that, right? With like drugs and alcohol.
Totally. They try to just silence it. And this inner voice it's a source of so much innovation, right? Like we use our inner voice, which, the way I define that is your ability to silently use language to reflect on your life. It's a remarkable tool. Like I use that to make sense of my experiences in the world, as many of us do. And so you don't want to get rid of it, but that's the lengths that people will go to because it can be so destructive. So that was surprising. I found the work on organizing our physical spaces really interesting and surprising too, that we can manage the voice in our head from the outside in. What else did I find surprising? That people who are deaf, they've got an inner voice too, but it takes a different form. They actually talk to themselves using internal sign language. So they see signing in their mind's eye rather than hearing voices.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Like that was pretty cool. So there were a lot of really interesting little nuggets that I came across. It was a really enjoyable experience to write the book, except when it wasn't enjoyable.
I've often wondered what the inner monologue of my cat is like. Is it just a series of weird sounds and meows and purrs?
Yeah. It's a great it's a great question. I tell the story not about your cat, but one of my favorite studies that I talk about in the book was a study done by a British anthropologist named Andrew Irving, who was just really curious about what are the inner monologues of New Yorkers like. And so what he did is he just approached random people on the streets of New York and gave them a tape recorder and asked them to just articulate as they walked down the city streets the thoughts that were streaming through people's heads. And I talk about some of the things they said, and you can actually listen to these segments online. They're just fascinating. You hear people, start talking about that. Oh my God, I can't believe she has cancer. Wait, where's the staples? Yeah, the cancer is so devastating. And how am I going to go? Wait, do I have to get a stapler? And there's like almost saccading back and forth between thinking about different kinds of experiences in a very fragmented way. Just really fascinating to get into other people's heads like this person did. It definitely made me think that I would hate for other people to have like a live feed into my inner monologue. Like, if you think about social media, Facebook as an example, the prompt that you see when you log into social media is to write what is on your mind. I don't know if that's the best prompt that we want to be giving people. There's a lot of stuff happening up in all of our heads that I think is useful to keep up there. And so just learning about the phenomenology of these negative thought loops and why we talk to ourselves, that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I have negative thoughts all the time. Sometimes I have thoughts that are horrific.
Horrific. Yeah. And guess what, Max? You should see. No, I'm just joking. You're not alone. So here's another distinction that I think is a really important one. People vary quite a bit in number one, whether they think they can actually control their thoughts and feelings or not. Some people think, no, they're just not controllable. And others think, of course you can control your thoughts and feelings. Well, it turns out you can get a little nuanced here in a way that I think is useful. If you ask me, can a person control the thoughts that spontaneously pop into their head? I don't know of any research that would say that a person can. But can a person control how they engage with those thoughts, right? How they elaborate on them, how they allow those thoughts to impact their emotions? Yes, absolutely. There are many things you could do to channel your emotional experiences. But that distinction is really useful because, like, sometimes I'll experience a really negative, dark thought and something that I'm ashamed of. I don't beat myself up about that because I know there are quirks having to do with the human mind that we don't understand yet. And I'm not going to beat myself up for having that negative thought because I have no control. But what I will hold myself responsible for is whether I allow that thought to then influence me for the rest of the day in ways that are self-sabotaging.
Right. That's where it becomes pathologic, right? Is if that thought becomes a negative feedback loop. I've been on the platform of the New York City subway, and I've dead ass thought to myself, what would it be like if I jumped in front of the oncoming train? I've
Yeah.
thought, what would happen to me? What would it be like if I pushed somebody in front of the oncoming train? Like I've seriously thought about those two things. I've had even crazier thoughts than that.
I would bet that if we were able to get people to admit candidly what thoughts just spontaneously pop into their heads, there'd be a whole set of really dark thoughts that we come across. And it's not clear why people have those thoughts. There's this funny movie, is it This Is 40, where I think that's the name of Paul Rudd and I think Leslie John, and I forget, I think it was Leslie John. Like, I think about what would happen if my husband dies a lot. And and she would describe. I'm getting this right. It just pops into her head. Like, why would someone have that thought? And should we now judge that person for having that thought? They're really interesting philosophical questions.
No, I think that we have those thoughts. I think we have those thoughts because we can have those thoughts. I think it's that simple.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question for sure. I would say that's a hypothesis. I don't disagree with it, but
yeah. It's like a cat, because we're unique. Well, maybe unique is the wrong word. There are probably some other species that are able to, but we can ponder the future. We can reminisce about the past. And that gift that we have is both a blessing and a curse, right?
You just summed up the thesis of my book, Chatter, right? This ability we have to travel in time in our mind, to introspect, is one of our greatest superpowers, but it can also be the source of enormous misery. And what really excites me about the science surrounding this topic is we've developed some understanding of the tools people can use to navigate that internal introspective space, to help people wield that amazing power more constructively and reduce the likelihood that they'll use it to get in trouble. And I think that's making a lot of progress. If you look back historically to the tools that people have used to manage their emotions, the emotional mind, like, it's remarkable how much progress we have made. I mean, it wasn't that long ago where you had people doing ice pick lobotomies to help people deal with extreme forms of emotional distress, poking holes in the frontal cortex to calm people down. In fact, that technique actually won someone a Nobel Prize. It's shocking today, right? But actually, the discovery of the lobotomy was a Nobel Prize-winning discovery. So that was a technique used for extreme forms of emotion, dysregulation. But man, we've come a lot farther than that more recently with respect to our ability to manage this emotional mind. And I think that's making progress. Still got a lot to do, but we're on the right track.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one.
When we find things not intrinsically interesting and we tend to just wander away and we're not aware of it, there's no hope of getting it back. So it's both that you want to be able to bring your attention forward when you know that it's not going to be intrinsically interesting, but you got to cultivate a different set of muscles to do that. And I think that this is where understanding the kind of full scope of attention could be very useful, because attention is not focus alone. That's only one of its many systems. We already talked about working memory, and in some sense, working memory is once you've focused, and this is formally called the orienting attention system of attention, sort of like a flashlight. Wherever you direct it, that's where the resources of your brain are going, and that's how they're calibrated. Working memory picks up after that. So I'm focusing on you right now. Right now in my working memory, I'm constantly updating and holding anything you say to me, even the look on your face. All of that's going into working memory. Still kind of the same system, but there's two other ways that attention works that I think then will give you a sense that, you may feel like you have challenges in one area, but you may be excellent in other areas. That's typically even what we find with patients with ADD. It's not that there's a blanket attentional challenge. It's that the calibration, sort of like a mixing board, a little off. Meaning sometimes the focusing thing is either too high or too low, but the other systems may be fine, or maybe another system is too high or too low in some sense. So that also helps understand that these are just differences people have, and we can work toward being better able to manipulate the levers of our mind in some sense more fluidly, and we can train to do this.
Should somebody with attention deficits in a given context try to change their own intrinsic ability to focus, or should they be seeking rather to change the context? Yeah,
Both.
both.
We
Interesting.
can advantage ourselves in both ways. But so let me tell you about the two other systems because that'll help explain why I just said this, right?
Yeah.
So in addition to this really laser focus, this orienting system, a second way our attention works is almost the exact opposite. It's about being broad and receptive, something we call the alerting system.
Hmm.
And that the metaphor I like to use is like a floodlight. The thing that it cares about, this particular system, is it selects not based on the information, but based on the time. Alerting is for now, like what's most important right now. So you got to be broad and receptive. And the way I think about it is if you were driving down the street and you see like a yellow light on the side of the road flashing, usually that means, okay, pay attention. You don't know what it is, like construction or children running around. You don't know what it is, but you got to be vigilant and aware and receptive. Very different. And I think oftentimes people that may have trouble focusing can actually read the room a lot better than a lot of other people. They can kind of get the gestalt or the tone of what's going on in a broader sense. So that's what I meant by they can be complementary. And then the third system, when I say it, you'll be like, oh yeah, of course. And you already know this probably term, executive control. So executive control is not about the focusing or the broadening, it's about the management.
Hmm.
So what are my goals right now? And is my behavior aligned with my goals? And I often talk about it, and it's very much like the executive of a company, right? The executive's job is not to go in there and do every single task, but to kind of broadly oversee and ensure and course correct when there are problems. So what I think about with the kind of metaphor I like to use for executive control is like a juggler. Just make sure you got to update, you got to inhibit, you got to shift tasks. All that stuff happens in the context of using those two other systems better. So I think that when I was saying, you said, should we change the environment or should we change our mind? I think we can always advantage ourselves by training our mind to be able to flexibly and more strongly and more consistently engage in all three of these functions. But there's such easy things we can do to advantage our environment. So for example, that flashlight I was talking about, it's great at being directed, but it'll get yanked around. So if we're sitting here and you have every intention, Mishi, my eyes are on you, I'm focusing on you. If you get some alert on your phone and you have a particular sound for a particular kind of alert, you're going to pay attention to it. It's like, oh, I got to check this out. And totally healthy, normal thing for our brain to do is advantaged and evolutionarily selected to do that. But most alerts are not something you got to orient toward, especially if you're doing deep work. So turn off the alerts, turn off the notifications, close the extra windows that you don't need, dedicate time, and then as you're doing whatever attentionally demanding task, keep always this broad receptive floodlight aware of where your mind is moment by moment. That's going to give the executive control system a lot more opportunity to say, you're not where you need to be, get back. And that's what I mean by you can advantage your environment and your mind.
It's so true. Like phones exert almost a gravitational pull on attention.
They do.
And phones aren't the only devices, right? Like,
No.
or objects. There's books, magazines, so it's, even though phones are fairly new in terms of the human historical record. I mean, there have always been things, that when present pull your attention away. So I guess that's very smart advice to curate your environment carefully.
It definitely is, but here's the thing, and it's really funny when you look back at the historic, because I was very curious. When did we start thinking that our attention is not our own, that it's constantly going everywhere? And is it really driven by our technology-rich environment? But you can look back at people from Many, many hundreds of years ago, there's medieval monks that talk about not being able to pay attention to their prayer life because they were preoccupied about lunch or something a family member might have said. And they would go to these extreme measures to cut off ties or, whatever they did didn't work.
Isolate themselves from women,
Well, all of that,
right?
everything they did was to move toward being able to have a more direct spiritual connection with God, and their mind kept interrupting them. So that's the other warning, and that's why I said both, the internal and the external, because even if you clear everything out, you're secluded in a hut in the middle of nowhere, your mind's going to interrupt you. Your mind is going to distract you, and all of this means get more comfortable, befriend your mind, understand your attention at a granular level, not at I tend to be like this or that, but moment to moment. And this is something that we technically in the field of psychology call meta awareness. So meta meaning toward itself, and awareness really of what's going on right now. And I put it more plainly as pay attention to your attention and train for that.
Pay attention to your attention. I love that. What about impulse control and our tendency towards impulsivity?
Right. That's again, in many ways, executive control, the juggler not being able to kind of ratchet in what's going on. And think about the last time you felt like there was some impulse control challenge, like simple, innocuous thing. Oftentimes I think of like you're walking into an office. Pre-COVID, this was more often. Now you just don't see this. There's a tray full of candy bars there, right? And then next to it, like a bunch of veggies. And you feel that like war in your brain, like, I just want that candy bar. I just don't feel like having a carrot right now. So typically, especially if you were busy, stressed, and all these things we talked about, stress, threat, poor mood, the chances of you being able to actually resist the candy bar are going to be reduced because we need full fuel in all of these gas tanks to be able to function. But if you could catch that impulse more sooner in time, the chances of rerouting may be greater. So if you walk into the room, you say, look at that. Amisha's going to feel the pull of the candy bars. I kind of distance yourself, and Amisha's going to make choices. And I'm talking to myself in the third person, not just to be vain, but because it actually helps distance yourself from the immersion of the pull. Like Misha's going to feel the pull of the candy bar.
So that's an exercise you recommend to actually
decentering. Yes, we can talk about that. This is a very good way to deal with impulse control. Is if you are just I just want that candy bar. I'm sorry, I'm obsessing over candy. I don't really want a candy bar right now anyway. But if you just
trust me, we get it.
If you are just in the pull of the moment, you will have a more difficult time regulating. So any situation in which you're prone to having impulse control challenges, start by that kind of decentered, self-supportive orientation. And I use that, again, it's a technical term, so just to unpack it, another way to say it is take a bird's eye view of the situation. Like you're kind of hovering above, watching your mind, and do it in a very self-supportive manner. Like you're not trying to be punitive, like don't you dare do that. It's more like, this is what's going on right now, like you're a reporter on the sidelines. And when you do that with your own mind, the opportunity for you to intervene is going to increase. And the pull and the what's called cognitive fusion, your linked capacity with that event is going to be diminished. So you could actually have a lot more opportunity to take control.
Wow, I'm going to use that. Like, oh shit, Max is going for his 6th Zollipop of the day. These are these like sugar-free lollipops that I've been kind of obsessed with. They're supposed to be good for your oral health. I don't know, but I probably eat too many of them. Anyway, so that's super interesting. So talking to yourself in third person, I'm really interested in these exercises to help bolster our ability to better connect with our goals, right? And to live a life with more integrity,
Absolutely. We want that. And I think that the main reason I would say, in addition to implementing on the fly in the moment, but to train for it, is the same way you train for your physical excellence, right? Like I was thinking about this even flying out to LA, putting my suitcase up on top of the overhead compartment. And, I could do it. I'm like, I've been swimming. I'm feeling better and stronger even after not working out all that much during COVID. And I'm like, you know what? If in this moment I couldn't do that, it would make no sense to just drop to the floor and start doing push-ups. Like that would be a bad way to orient to the situation. I had to have this intrinsic capacity to use it now. And the same way goes for our attention, for our mind. If we train for it, we don't know when we're going to need it. And we need to have full access to it so that no matter what, we're on it. We have access to it. And that's where the mindfulness training came in. Because as I was saying earlier, all of these other approaches just didn't have generalizable benefits, but mindfulness training did. So that's what we've been recommending. And then we've been on a hunt in my lab to figure out what's the shortest amount of time we can do this in so it's time efficient for time pressured and performance pressured individuals.
Maybe we should walk through some common circumstances that people find themselves in, and perhaps ways that they can ready themselves for optimal cognitive performance in that context. Somebody, for example, who's about to give an important presentation at work. How can they prime their mind for a peak mind?
Yeah.
In that specific circumstance, and maybe starting with like the morning, like
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm happy to do that, but given what I just said about the importance of training, I want to give at least one training tool, because the morning of is going to go a lot better when you have a big thing to do if you've been preparing and doing this for the long haul leading up to that moment. Because the preparatory period matters, and I'll tell you why. So, in the work that we do with these groups like Special Operations Forces, football players, we train the entire University of Miami football team, actually.
I hear they have a football team. That's awesome. No, I'm not a sports dude.
Well, neither am I.
Sydney always makes fun of me, but yeah.
You should have seen me trying to deal with a bunch of football players. It was actually quite fun. But what we know is this. Now, I want to tell you this because I think it leads up to the thing that you want, and which most people want is like, show me what to do when I need it. Like, actionable right now. And I think that we will do that. But I want you to understand, just like the physical fitness analogy, what you could do every day, and for not that long. Our research over the last 15 years or so has gotten it down to 12 minutes a day of how much time you need to spend with this type of brain training to advantage and strengthen your attention.
Amazing.
So, but I wanted to go back to telling you why this is so important, and why high stress circumstances like giving a big deal talk, or taking a big test, or in the context of our populations, having to perform surgery, or being deployed to a war zone, or, it's game day and you better perform. So all of those things, what we know is when you track people over a high demand interval, and by the way, we did this on University of Miami students, what we found was that even over the course of the academic semester, it's a high demand interval. And you know this from your experience. You feel a lot different at the end of the semester than at the beginning of the semester. So over a high demand interval, when we track attention, when we look to see.
Yeah, I get weird spam calls from Miami. Actually, it's very odd. All of the literally nobody calls me with a Miami phone number, but then I get these spam calls, and they have a 305 number, and I know that they're spam. So
Exactly.
very easy filtering process.
So anyway, so you track people, you bring them into the lab, you have them do a whole attentional battery, and then you say, come back in 8 weeks. And during that, or 4 weeks, and during those weeks intervening, something intense is going on. Either they've got finals and exams and things like that. Not finals, but just exams and regular coursework, or pre-deployment training, or athletic camps, or they're prepping for hurricane season if they're a firefighter. So you get it, like this different high demand, and people can translate that into high demand intervals in their own lives, right? So even if you're preparing for like a big case, you're a lawyer, or a big sales season if you're an entrepreneur, whatever it is, when the demands are intensive and protracted, even over something like 4 weeks, attention significantly declines. So if you do nothing at all in the preparation for the big day, you've got less attention than you did 4 weeks ago.
Wow. Why? Just because you're just so unprepared?
No, because you are using your attention, and attention is like, we talked about it as fuel. It's a limited resource. The gas tank will get emptied.
Wow.
With repeated use. So then the question becomes, if the default of what happens is degradation, reduction in the availability of this fuel, and then at the end of the interval, I got to go do something big, that's not a great scenario to be in. So is there anything that could level this off so I don't see degradation? And, oftentimes you'll hear the term resilience, like bounce back from adversity or bounce back from a challenge. What I was interested in was really pre-zilliance. Like, you don't even need resilience. You just protect against it, stay stable, and keep staying stable over time, which seemed like a fantasy in some sense. Like, can you actually even do that? And that's what I was interested in. So in the first set of studies that we did, offering mindfulness training and comparing it to nothing at all, it was pretty straightforward. Like, we were seeing, and it was a surprise to us in some sense because this was not regular people. This was pre-deployment Marines. And we had something like 24 hours of formal training time. We asked them to do 30 minutes a day of mindfulness practice, and we can talk about the specific examples of the practices they got. But what shocked me is that if we gave them nothing at all, the subgroup of Marines that got nothing, definitely significant decline. From the people that got the training, as a group, they actually weren't that impressive. Because what we noticed, surprise, surprise, is like most of them, not most of them, about half of them totally disregarded us, didn't do any of the practices. They'd show up to class, but they were pretty much checked out.
Hmm.
So we're like, you know what? Just seeing if they're in the group that was receiving mindfulness training is not a good way to go because there's so much variability in their engagement. Just like signing up for an exercise program and then never leaving your couch.
Hmm.
Just signing up isn't enough. So we looked to see how much they were actually practicing, and we found there that gave us gold. There was a dose response effect. The more people practiced, the more they benefited. And there was something like a minimum effective dose. At that point, about 12 minutes a day or more, people benefited. They stayed stable over time. And if they did a lot, they actually increased over time in terms of their attention. People that did less than 12 minutes, not a lot of benefit. In fact, they looked just like the no training group. So this gave us clues like there are ways we can actually level off and keep attention stable. And just like physical exercise, the more you do, the more you can benefit.
I love the term they used, pre-zilliance.
Yeah.
That's amazing. No, but you're so right. It's like we spend all this time training in the gym, bolstering, building up our physical fitness. For what? It's so that that when the day comes, we're exposed to a pathogen, we are more resilient. Our immune systems are more robust, right?
Yep.
So I love how you've applied the same concept to attention and the mental, challenges that inevitably are going to pop up in our day-to-day lives. So talk to me about the regimen. Like, what is
Yeah.
this
So
12-minute routine?
exactly. So let's just start with sort of one of the most foundational practices that we have, and that's part of mindfulness. I didn't invent, right? It's part of the world's wisdom traditions. It's been around for thousands of years, and bringing it to the modern age has been around for about half a century, 55 years or so of research on mindfulness. What people have done, people like a, a teacher and friend of mine, John Kabat-Zinn, has taken sort of the traditions and brought it into a context where there's no requirement for a particular worldview, but the core practices are offered. And what he did is he offered an 8-week program, and it has one of these practices that I'm about to describe to you. But I think the key to this is that it really is brain training. And I was approaching it from the neuroscience perspective to see what's the workout, exactly the question you're asking, and how much of the workout do people need to do? And that's where we came to 12 minutes. So, but when I started looking a little bit more deeply, I was starting to connect the dots between my expertise in attention and what mindfulness exercises are actually asking us to do. And I do think it helps to kind of understand or orient in that way. So, one very common one is something called just mindfulness of breathing, but I actually refer to it as the find your flashlight practice.
Mm.
Because to me, it's not so much about the breath. It's not actually. It could be anything. You could focus on your big toe if you want to. I don't care. It's about what your attention is doing and advantaging your ability to find out what your attention is doing. So in the practice, and I'll just go through it. You don't have to do it right now, but just to kind of name it. So you sit in a comfortable, upright posture, really like you were saying earlier, advantage the environment. Don't be in the middle of a busy coffee shop with like your all your devices around and people talking to you. Quiet, supportive, and then commit to some period of time you're going to do this. I would recommend starting really low dose, 1 minute, maybe 30 seconds, and notice yourself just sitting and breathing. And you can close or lower your eyes if that's more comfortable to kind of reduce the environmental input. And you want to really take a posture. It doesn't, you don't have to sit on a special mat or anything. You're not going to start levitating, but the key is that you take the posture of sort of dignified presence. This is an exercise in waking up and about having more capacity. So upright, but not really uptight. You're not trying to control yourself. And then you notice yourself breathing, and then pick something prominent related to breathing. So it could be the coolness of air moving in and out of your nostrils, or maybe you notice something in your back. Wherever it is for you, you're going to make that the target for your attention. And then for the whole period of time you've committed to doing this, that's where you want to shine the flashlight. Just keep your focus right there. And it's hard to do. It's just like at first you got to figure out where it is, and then you got to set the flashlight there. But that's the goal. That's the executive control saying your goal for this period of time is to keep the flashlight on that attentional target. Then next step, so it's like focus is the first step.
Well, I'm not an expert in meditation, but I was trained in the Vedic style of meditation, and it sounds identical to Vedic meditation
It's the
practice.
same thing.
With Vedic meditation, you're just focusing on a mantra that they give you.
So let's go to the next step, because I think that very much will align with transcendental meditation, other forms of what we call concentrative practice. So, and there is nothing special about this. Like I said, the only difference would be, whereas the mantra may be tied to the traditions, maybe potentially Hindu or other traditions, right? Vedic is definitely Hindu. When you're focusing on your breath, that's not part of any particular worldview. Everybody's got a breath. So it opens it up in ways for people that may not want to have a particular Sanskrit phrase that they repeat over and over again. It invites more people in, and it doesn't take away from anything that other people are doing that may be focusing on a mantra instead. So I just wanted to say, is this in the spirit of inclusivity and flexibility for various people? So anyway, so you're focusing on your target. Now that could be your mantra, that could be your breath related sensation. But the reason I would say try the breath, if you have another way that you're doing this, is because the breath is changing moment by moment. You're not having to create anything. You're not having to generate anything or repeat it, even in your working memory. It's just happening. And it's changing. It's got a changing nature, and you're with it. So you're not controlling the breath. This is not pranayama. This is not breath manipulation, which is a great thing to do. These are all great things to do. This is taking an observational stance toward something that is already transpiring and just focusing in on it with specificity, like a laser. Like it's this particular point on my nose that I'm going to focus in on. The next moment, the next sort of aspect of the instruction after it's about focusing is noticing. Keep that that floodlight broad and receptive. You're on this sort of monitoring mission. You got the flashlight going, monitoring. When you notice that your mind has wandered, take the flashlight, gently return it back, just like you would for any other object, right? Whether it's a mantra, etc. So I hope that it's you can see the dots getting connected here. You've got the flashlight engaged. You got the floodlight working to ensure receptivity. You've got the juggler or the executive control getting you back on track. So with each repetition of that, you're just exercising all three systems. And what I think that is exciting about this is you're not only exercising them individually, you're exercising their coordination. And that can really be powerful. Now, this practice is one of the 12-minute practices that we offer, but then there are other practices, and I don't think we'll have time to go through all of them, but would emphasize just the floodlight. You're going to train the floodlight. It's a different kind of orientation. This is where probably a lot of Vedic and transcendental approaches and mindfulness may diverge, because mindfulness is really about paying attention to our present moment experience without this editorializing or reactivity aspect to it. So that's going to be the focus of the next set of exercises people do.
Wow. So you do these basically, would you say every day?
12 minutes a day.
12 minutes a day.
Yeah. 3 to 5 days a week, we start seeing benefits.
3 to 5? 3 to 5?
Yeah.
Wow. That's incredible. And these generally, like, what populations, is it just a general population that you've seen success in, or is it
because we saw benefits in probably groups that I didn't think we would, like our initial studies, I was like, because it was the first time we ever brought mindfulness practices into the laboratory to interrogate with the gold standard of research with attention. Like this has been around for thousands of years, but to interrogate them, meaning examine them with a randomized controlled trial where some people get the training versus not, this is all new. So the very first studies I did, I was like, I'm not willing to just put it out there and see what happens. Let me go to where I think the chances of seeing something, if it's real, are going to be really high. So we actually didn't start with the randomized trial. What we did is we started with maybe not quite Olympic level, but probably like marathon runner level meditators. So we partnered with this retreat center in Colorado where people were going to be practicing mindfulness for 10 to 12 hours a day for a month. And I said, if there's a tractable chance, if I can actually pick this up with my metrics, I should see it here. If I don't see it here, That's probably not a lot of chance that I'm going to see it other places. And so we gave these same experiments that I was telling you about with the soldiers and football players, et cetera, but we gave them to people. We took our laptops to the retreat center, tested these people, came back a month later, tested them again, and then we found sort of age and education matched controls that didn't go on retreat. And that showed significant and strong effects. So I'm like, okay, I think our metrics are sensitive. They're picking this up. Because remember that whole thing I told you about generalizability? We had no idea, even though on paper, reading the descriptions of these practices and even practicing myself, I got the sense this is definitely tapping into attention. I had no idea if it'd be generalizable. Can you go from focusing on your breath quietly by yourself and now look at a computer screen with different lights and stimuli appearing and find benefits? It requires a transfer, right, of one skill set to another context. So that was exciting to see it. But then we kind of went almost in the other direction. I'm like, what's the most challenging circumstances in which I'm probably not going to see something
Hmm.
unless it's a robust signal and the amount of time that people are practicing is enough? And that was looking at medical and nursing students and then off to pre-deployment soldiers and special operators where they're about to enter a war zone and lots going on. And if you do nothing at all, you definitely see degradation. But even in those individuals, we saw beneficial effects. So we have broadened out this from sort of elite level to high demand to now everyday people. So, working with, for example, military spouses who are not being deployed, but they're in an intensive environment. Or we just did we just did a partnership project with a local company that does accounting. Everybody in the company got access to this, or a real estate company. So we're broadening out. In fact, there's a project we're doing with the city of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where the former mayor has offered it to the entire community.
Wow.
And when we track it, we see all walks of life. People do these practices 12 to 15 minutes a day, 3 to 5 days a week. They are experiencing beneficial effects.
So cool. Is there anything that you could do morning of or
Yeah,
right
yeah, yeah,
before,
yeah.
like
Good, good.
like a booster shot?
Exactly. So one of the things I would say is if you got something big on the morning of, maybe do more than 12 minutes. It sounds counterintuitive.
Mm.
And I noticed this even, writing this book. As I was writing the book, you'd feel the pressure, you'd feel the confusion, the exhaustion. I'm like, instead of doing less because I feel time pressured, what if I just did a few minutes more? And I felt like I kind of felt better doing, sometimes I'd be like, I'm going to do a double dose today
Wow.
and it would help. So, but that's if you have the time, right? But literally it's the morning of you're like prepping, sitting on the sidelines and, whatever it is, giving a talk or doing whatever intensive activity you're about to do. One thing I suggest is something called a stop practice, which is almost like a mini practice tied to everything we just talked about with mindfulness training. Very simple because the momentum of your mind is going to be strong when there's a high pressure event occurring, right? It's like the anticipation, the worry, maybe even reflecting on the last time you did something similar. So the stop practice, the first step is just very straightforward. Stop. Like whatever's going on, the momentum of your mind and your body physically stop. It's a great thing to do, by the way, if you're driving and you see a stop sign. Stop. The next step, T, S is for stop. T, take a breath. And that means just allow the breath to occur, but you're really experiencing it. You're really there for it. O, observe. And that's now orient back to, you're not focusing on the breath anymore. Just what's going on around you, within you. Proceed. And what you did in that moment is essentially you got your flashlight back, no matter where it was. You got it now. And then you can use it with more efficiency.
Wow. What does stop stand for again? Just real quick.
Stop,
Yeah.
take a breath, T. O, observe, P, proceed.
Stop, take a breath, observe, proceed.
Yeah.
I love that. Where do stimulants fall into the recommendation? Like, um, I'm off caffeine. A lot of people
Wow.
self-medicate. Yeah. 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 And it's one of the best decisions I've ever made, honestly.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you feel that way in the first couple weeks?
No, it took me I mean, you probably know a lot more about the pharmacology of caffeine than I do, but what I know subjectively is that it took me only like 3, 4 days
Hmm.
of just fatigue, feeling like I was kind of moving underwater to feel like I was off of it. Um, but yeah, I mean, when doing these practices in the morning, I mean, do you recommend doing the practices before, after? Because many people do start their mornings with a cup of coffee.
Yeah. What I would say is this, especially because you're going to be introducing something new to your life, take it slow and don't try to do multiple changes at once. So if you're on a caffeine extraction mission, don't introduce mindfulness at the same time. So let's say people actually already drink a cup of coffee. I don't want you to change that, at least initially for this particular aspect. The short answer to your question of when to do this is you want to do it when you're actually going to do it. Like, it doesn't matter. We could talk around this in circles, but really you need to play around with this in your own life so that you're actually accomplishing this 12-minute goal. And what I know works, what I know helps is attaching it to something you already have in your routine. So going back to what you were saying about a morning cup of coffee, what have we've heard reports of from people from our many studies is if they practice, because they know they're going to have a morning cup of coffee right before they have it, they actually enjoy the cup of coffee more. They don't feel like they're mindlessly pouring another cup and kind of amping themselves up. They actually savor. And if they do it right after, same thing. It's just like they feel a little bit more integrated into their day moving forward. So a lot of times people will do it right before or after brushing their teeth. And even notice, like, use the mindfulness approach when they're brushing their teeth. I'm sure none of us, I'm sure everybody that's probably listening at some point in the last 24 hours has brushed their teeth. Probably didn't notice the
You'd hope.
tingly. You'd hope. Let's just put it out there that this is a positive thing everybody's doing for their well-being. Most of us have no memory of doing this. And we certainly didn't experience a tingling peppermint or whatever sensation. We missed it. And that's, really that's an important thing. Like, we're missing a lot because we're just not there. Our mind is somewhere else. And it's not like it's going to be the most joy-filled thing, but try it out. See what it feels like to be in any moment and actually be in it. But anyway, so just to say that it is a good idea to yoke it to whatever habits you already have, and then start really slow. So if you think work up to 12 minutes, but if you think you can do 3 minutes, do 1 minute and give yourself that real boost of a win when you accomplish it. Now, just to get back to granular aspects of the practice I described, even the stop practice, most people, when they start on this journey with mindfulness or transcendental meditation, they get super frustrated because, like, my mind is really busy and I wander a lot. I can't do this. I cannot stay focused. But think back to the instruction I gave. It was focus on breath-related sensations. When you notice your mind wander, it's like, I'm not saying if you happen to be one of those weirdos whose mind wanders a lot. Everybody's mind wanders. In fact, it wanders about 50% of our waking moments. It's normative. It's healthy. Our brains were built for this distractibility. The win is when you notice it. So get that kind of orientation toward your practice and really your life. Anytime you notice that you've been lost and you come back, think of it as a win. Like, oh, I'm back. I'm holding the flashlight again. That's really good. So anyway, I know that was a little bit of a digression, but what I would say is start slow, yoke it to a practice. Try to integrate multiple moments of this throughout. I would say anytime you're at a stop sign or waiting for anything, even if you're waiting for an elevator, waiting in line, let's see what happens if you don't pull out your phone and just be there. Like, actually be there and try it for a few moments every day. But make a commitment to yourself and then stay with it, like any kind of good routine or even an exercise routine.
I think it's also really smart. You said that people who drink coffee after this practice tend to really enjoy it, or they see a potentiated boost to
Yeah.
their. I think it's really wise to build into your routine something before the morning coffee, because
Mm-hmm.
so frequently we rush to the kitchen, pour ourselves a cup immediately after waking up, and we have this diurnal circadian cortisol spike in the morning, which lasts for 45 minutes to an hour after we wake up. And I just think that putting caffeine into that hormonal milieu is never a good idea. So it's always, I think, always smart to give yourself a little bit of time in the morning before you reach for the cup of coffee. And of course, nobody listening to this is actually going to do that, but it's smart. It's good advice.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that people are going to be at different stages of accepting your words of wisdom. But this might give them another activity to do that's in the service of their wellness.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
We don't rise to the level of, other people's expectations as much as we fall to the level of our own training, and I think, again, we have a to-do list, which is rapidly growing, but do we have a to-learn list? Like, what's on everyone's to-learn list? And I think we do these things where now, if especially if you are spending more time at home or have been spending more time at home and you have more time, like what are you putting on there? Because the future belongs to those learners, right? We have to constantly be upgrading our knowledge, our skills, our own abilities to be more valuable.